Well, welcome and thank you. I'm getting older at this. I remember being, as we'll see it in the last slide, I remember being in Dayton for the 75th anniversary. And now we're at the 100th. I didn't, gosh, did I ever think I'd be this old? I didn't think I'd ever be here. Well, because you are, this captures the history and folklore. That's John Scopes, of course, and that, well, I don't know, that's York, the actor who would later play in Bewitched, but he played Scopes in the movie, Inherit the Wind. Now, because you're watching the play, and I hope all of you go to the play, what I thought I'd do is, if I could get this to move forward, there. If this works, we'll see. I was going to show you just a clip of the beginning of the movie, and you'll see, when you go to the play, an interesting difference. But this will sort of set the tone, and then I'm going to talk about both the play and the movie. Let's see if it works. There it is.
Good morning, young ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, visitors. For our science lesson for today, we will continue our discussion of Darwin's theory of the descent of man. Now, as I told you yesterday, Darwin's theory tells us that man evolved from a lower order of animals, from the first wiggly protozoa here in the sea, to the ape, and finally, to man. Now, some of you fellows out there are probably going to say that's why some of us act like monkeys. But what Mr. Charles Darwin was trying to tell us in his own way...
Bertram T. Cates?
Come off it, Sam. You've known me all my life.
Bert, you're charged with violation of Public Act 31428, Volume 37, Statute Number 31428 of the State Code, which makes it unlawful for any teacher of the public schools to teach any theory that denies the creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. Bertram Cates, I hereby place you under arrest.
Well, there you have it. It may be the most famous scene in the legendary encounter between science and religion to occur in American history or cinema. A delegation of townspeople, stirred by the preaching of Reverend Jeremiah Brown, that's his name in the movie, and the play, whose name evokes images of the fanaticism of the biblical Jeremiah and the murderous abolitionist John Brown, takes a young science teacher from his public school classroom and throws him in jail for teaching his students about the Darwinian theory of human evolution. Such teaching supposedly undermines their faith in the biblical account of creation. American viewers of this scene presumably know that the teacher in this historic encounter was actually John Scopes, and that it occurred during the summer of 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee. And this is what Scopes looked like when he put on his Harold Lloyd version round horn-rimmed glasses. In the best-known retelling of this episode, which appears in the enduring 1955 play, which you'll be seeing here, and the 1960 movie Inherit the Wind, the main characters, except for Brown and Scopes' fiancée, who had no parallels in Dayton. There was no minister like that in Dayton, and Scopes didn't have a fiancée. The others are given sound-alike pseudonyms for their real ones, and the time is set, and I quote, "in summer not too long ago." That's why whenever you see scenes in the movie, you never see cars. You never see anything that can date the movie, whether it's 1925 or 1955 or 60. Nothing tells you. That's intentional. The movie version opens, as we saw, with town officials led by Brown hauling Scopes from his classroom for teaching evolution. When you see the play, you will see, limited to fewer scenes, the play actually begins with Scopes already in jail, with a threatening crowd, and this was intentional, a literal lynch mob outside. According to the script, and I'm quoting from the script right here, the instructions in the script of the play, for innocently doing his job, Scopes is threatened with fine and imprisonment. Obviously wasn't threatened with imprisonment because the statute didn't cover imprisonment. But anyway, it makes for powerful drama, a scene seared in the national consciousness, both by the play, the movie, and also by the trial. But it never happened the way it happened in Inherit the Wind. The trial was not a witch hunt led by a fundamentalist firebrand, but a bizarre publicity stunt concocted by secular civic leaders in Dayton. Earlier in 1925, the Tennessee state legislature had passed a statute making it a misdemeanor punishable by a maximum fine of $500 for a public school teacher to teach, as quoted in the film you saw, to teach any theory that denies the story of divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to instead teach that man descended from a lower order of animal. Upon learning of this restriction, the New York-based American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, which then did not have a Tennessee chapter, issued a press release offering to assist any teacher willing to challenge that law, the constitution of that law, in court. They were anticipating a declaratory judgment suit, not a criminal trial, as their notes point out. John Scopes became that willing client at the invitation of Dayton civic leaders, and we ended up later retold in the movie Inherit the Wind. Now, the question comes out, if it wasn't started by if this wasn't a local lynch mob, if this wasn't started by a local firebrand fundamentalist minister, Jeremiah Brown, well then, why Dayton of all places? Indeed, a newspaper editorial, the main Pulitzer paper out of St. Louis, printed that, and Dayton took it up to publish a booklet, sort of a program that you could buy. You can probably see copies of it in Dayton. They produced a booklet with the title, of all places, why not Dayton? Situated midway between Knoxville and Chattanooga, in the valley carved by the Tennessee River and the rising foothills of East Tennessee, at the time, Dayton lacked both a sense of tradition and confidence in the future. The town's not an old town. It's not like Chattanooga. The town sprang up in the late 19th century with the coming of the railroads and became the commercial and governmental center for Ray County. It was part of the so-called New South. Northern money financed laying the rail lines, digging the nearby iron mines, and building a blast furnace that attracted hundreds of Scottish immigrants and underemployed Southerners to good jobs in the new town. But the local economy faltered when the blast furnace closed early in the new century. Concerned civic leaders actively courted new industry as they watched their town's population cut in half from a peak of 3,000 people during the 1890s to fewer than 1,800 by the time of the Scopes trial 30 years later. A New Yorker, George W. Rapelier, who at that time was living in Dayton, he had some training in civil engineering, most of an undergraduate degree from Ohio Northern University. He was managing the local, largely dormant coal and iron facilities in Dayton for their northern owners. Only 31 years of age, Rapelier had drifted away from his childhood Catholicism while in college and written letters to the Chattanooga Times opposing enactment of the Tennessee anti-evolution law. Upon reading in that newspaper on May 4th about the ACLU offer to help any Tennessee school teacher who challenged the new law in court, Rapelier saw a chance to strike the statute. He was an opponent of the statute. And he set about drawing other townspeople into his scheme by that age-old sales tactic, appeal to their self-interest. Well, Rapelier hurried down to this place. You can still see the building. I actually, when I was researching the book, it was still a drugstore. Hurried down to Frank Robinson's drugstore, newspaper in hand. By the time of the trial, they put up a sign, "It all started here," to try to attract tourists. Now, Robinson chaired the Ray County School Board, and the soda fountain in his downtown drugstore served as a watering hole for the town's business and professional elite during the days of national prohibition. "Mr. Robinson, you're always looking for something that'll get Dayton a little publicity. I wondered if you'd seen the morning paper," Robinson later recalled Rapelier asking him. Of course, Robinson had seen the morning paper, but he hadn't noticed this little box in it with the ACLU offer. Rapelier then related his scheme of staging a test case in Dayton. It would attract national attention, tourists, perhaps jobs. Well, Robinson slowly warmed to the idea, as did the school superintendent, Walter White, who was also there that morning. This is how it looked inside as they were surrounding the table discussing this idea. Again, the ACLU had thought this would be a declaratory judgment action, and therefore it said nobody needs to worry, no teacher's going to be risked. They know that's not going to attract attention. No, they want a criminal statute. They want a criminal indictment. So the drugstore conspirators summoned the town's 24-year-old general science instructor and football coach. He'd been hired the year before from University of Kentucky, where he just graduated from, to be the football coach up there. But as often happens, he was also thrown teaching general science. Now, Robinson offered me a chair, and the boy who worked at as a soda jerk brought me a fountain drink, Scopes later recalled. John, we've been arguing, said Rapelier, and I said that nobody could teach biology without teaching evolution. Well, that's right, I say. I'm not sure what he was leading up to. Again, these were quotes from Scopes. Scopes then went over to the counter, went over to the shelf, reached up and pulled down a copy of the biology text from the school's sales shelf. At that time, the state and the local community did not provide textbooks. You had to buy them yourself. And the enterprising Robinson, remember the school board chair, sold them at his drugstore. Scopes opened it to the section on human evolution. It's a small section. It's not dominant in the book. Austin Peay had looked over the book, the governor who signed the statute, and said, this book's fine, doesn't violate it. It's a small section, but it's there. This was a state-approved text, prescribed for use by every high school student in the state of Tennessee. And it included human evolution. You've been teaching them this book, Rapelier said. Yes, I said. I explained that I had used it briefly while filling in for the principal during an illness. He was the biology teacher. Then you've been violating the law, Robinson said. The school board chair then told Scopes about the ACLU and asked him, would you stand for a test case? Would you volunteer to be arrested? Would you say that you taught evolution? And he said yes. Well, Scopes, shown here with his father, presented an ideal defendant for the case. Single, easygoing, and without any fixed intention of staying in Dayton. He had little to lose from a summertime caper. The school board promised him his job back. Unlike the regular biology teacher, who had a family and administrative responsibilities. Scopes, as you can see, also looked the part of an earnest young teacher, complete with the homeroom glasses you saw earlier and the boyish face that made him appear academic but not threatening. Naturally shy, cooperative, and well-liked, he would not alienate parents or taxpayers with soapbox speeches on evolution or give the appearance of a radical or ungrateful public employee. Yet his friends knew that Scopes did disapprove of the new law and accepted an evolutionary view of human origins, but in an easygoing way. Indeed, he liked to talk about sports more than politics, and occasionally attended Dayton's Methodist church as a way, well, I'll use his words, a way to pick up girls. This was their defendant, an establishment's rebel who would test the law without causing trouble. ACLU counsel Arthur Garfield Hayes later confided, had we sought to find a defendant to present this issue, we couldn't have improved on John Scopes. Yet, despite Scopes's really ideal casting for his role, it became a bit part in both Inherit the Wind and also the actual trial. You can capture it in this poster for the movie. In both the trial and in Inherit the Wind, the prosecutor and defense attorneys and the press assume the leading roles. Who gets the name billing? The guy playing Bryan, the guy playing Scopes, and the guy playing H.L. Mencken, the reporter. They get the lead billing. They're the stars. They're all Academy Award winners for other plays and movies. Among those two, the real standouts, already the larger-than-life speakers and lawyers were Clarence Darrow and Williams Jennings Bryan, and they stole the show, both in the movie, the play you'll see, and at Dayton. Now, in Inherit the Wind, Bryan, Frederick Marsh, appears almost out of thin air. The audience learns that, and here is, just so you see, this is the actual Bryan showing up at Dayton, stepping off the train. He didn't have much hair up here, so he tried to cover his head from the sun. The audience learns in the play, when you watch it, that he, Bryan, or his pseudonym, was nominated for president 3 times and that he remained an influential public orator. Also, he retained a fundamentalist faith in the Bible. Only at the end does Gene Kelly, the actor playing the famed journalist H.L. Mencken, there's the real H.L. Mencken, explains something happens to an also-ran. That means he'd lost for president 3 times. He becomes a national unloved child, and unloved children of all ages insinuate themselves in the spotlights. In this instance, that's simply not true. The real-life Bryan did not so much insinuate himself into this spotlight as focus attention of the public on the social implications and religious implications of Darwinism. Ever since Charles Darwin published his theory of evolution in 1859, so 75 years earlier, 65 years earlier, some conservative Christians objected to the atheistic implications of its naturalistic explanation for the origins of human life and all biological species. Early in the 20th century, those objections intensified with the spread of fundamentalism as a reaction by some traditional Christian American Protestants against the increased, what they perceived as biblical literalism or modernism within their mainline denominations. Bryan, a political progressive, shown here earlier in life as a speaker, with a decidedly conservative religious belief, added his voice to the chorus following the First World War as he came to see Darwinian struggle for survival, fittest thinking, that's known as social Darwinism when you apply it to human society, behind German militarism, American imperialism, and laissez-faire corporate capitalism, the 3 deadly sins in Bryan's political theology. These he viewed came or resulted from a loss of Christian piety, which he in turn blamed on the rise of Darwinian thinking. As Bryan declared in one of his popular speeches, he gave many, he gave 200 speeches a year. That was his livelihood, speaking. But he had one at this time called It Is Written, in which he goes through the litany of results from evolutionary thinking and concludes with the statement, all of the ills for which America suffers can be traced back to the teaching of evolution. It was the problem. Now, Bryan was a progressive politician, traditionally, and he therefore had an instinct of seeking legislative solutions to social problems, whether it be women voting to end wars, because there wouldn't be another war like the First World War if women voted, he thought, or bimetallism to solve the economic problems of the 1890s. Didn't matter which it was. He's got a legislative solution to any social problem. And his solution becomes enacting state, not local, state restrictions against teaching of Darwinian theory of human evolution in public schools. Indeed, it had all the trappings of a political campaign as Bryan spoke, wrote, and lobbied for such laws across America, speaking in over 40 states and to joint sessions of the legislature in over 30 states, including, just before it passed the law, the state of Tennessee, up in Nashville. Then, when a lawsuit was begun, challenging his law, the first he'd succeeded totally with, Bryan volunteered his services for the prosecution at the behest of the World's Christian Fundamentalist Association. Now, Inherit the Wind provides a further explanation, a further rationale at least, not a correct explanation, for Darrow's participation in the small-town misdemeanor trial than it did for Bryan's appearance. But even here, the details differ sharply with reality. This is a picture of, allegedly, of Dayton, of Darrow being greeted at the border of Dayton by John Scopes and some of the locals Actually, he'd driven in by a road they didn't expect. He came into town, and they says, "No, go back out there, swing around, and come back in again." They're waiting with the photographers, so that's why we get the picture. In the play, in the version you're going to see, a jailed Scopes appeals to Mencken's newspaper for help getting a lawyer. Mencken then announces that his paper is sending, quote, "the most agile legal mind of the 20th century, Clarence Darrow." That agnostic, Reverend Brown, gasped, "a vicious, godless man." Well, both descriptions capture historically valid perceptions of Darrow. By the 1920s, Darrow unquestionably stood out as the most famous, some would say infamous, trial lawyer in America. Born into an educated working-class family in rural Kinsman, Ohio, Darrow first gained public notice when he defended famed socialist labor leader Eugene V. Debs against criminal charges arising out of the brutal 1894 Pullman strike. For the next 15 years, Darrow was the nation's outstanding labor defense lawyer at a time when labor was more militant and employers more hardened than ever before or since. Defendants, thereafter, after this period, Darrow gradually broadened his practice to include an odd mix of political radicals and, for a very high fee, wealthy murderers. These activities kept Darrow's name in newspaper headlines, such as during the 1924 Leopold Loeb case, one of the most sensational trials in American history, in which Darrow used arguments of psychological determinism to save two wealthy and intelligent Chicago teenagers from execution for their cold-blooded murder of a neighbor boy, a crime that the defendants allegedly committed for no other reason than to see if they could get away with it. Actually, one of them was simply a psychopath, and the other one was in rapture of him. And the result was, well, the death of the neighbor boy. Although Darrow's and others before that they weren't caught for. Although Darrow's defense outraged many Americans who believed in individual responsibility, it reflected his long-standing and oft-proclaimed belief in materialistic determinism. Darrow was not content with simply questioning popular notions of criminal responsibility, but delighted in challenging biblical concepts of morality, which typically viewed his defendants as very wrong. And in return, he viewed these biblical concepts of morality as both wrong and dangerous. Darrow welcomed the hullabaloo surrounding the anti-evolution crusade, Bryan's crusade. It rekindled interest in his legalistic attacks on the Bible, which once appeared hopelessly out of date in light of modern developments of mainline Christian thought, but regained relevance with the rise of fundamentalism. When the Scopes trial arose, Darrow volunteered his services for the defense, the only time in his life he ever volunteered free legal aid. He saw a chance to grab the limelight and debunk fundamentalist morality, and he liked doing both. Now, the movie presents him there at the stand, played by Spencer Tracy on that side. And for some crazy reason, at the stand with him, H.L. Mencken, which I can't figure out. But it worked for the movies. It never happened in real life. My object, Clarence Darrow later wrote about this, wrote about it in his autobiography, my object in going to Dayton was to focus the attention of the country on the program of Mr. Bryan and the other fundamentalists in America. Thus, unlike the story in Inherit the Wind, which you'll see, Darrow did not need to be, nor was he, sent to Dayton by Mencken's newspaper. Of course, Scopes need not and did not ask Mencken's newspaper to obtain defense counsel for him because he only agreed to test the law after the ACLU offered to defend him. It was the ACLU's case from the start, and Darrow would not have joined it if Bryan had stayed out. Then Darrow demanded in. Yet in the real trial, unlike the play and the movie, Darrow served as merely one member of a star-studded legal cast that assembled by the ACLU that included Arthur Garfield Hayes, a wealthy but Park Avenue attorney who regularly defended free speech cases across the country for the ACLU, and Dudley Field Malone, shown in this picture, an even wealthier New York divorce lawyer, drawn to the limelight of the Scopes litigation. Malone had been, when Bryan was Secretary of State under Wilson, Malone had been his number 2 person. These other attorneys who actually argued more of the case than Darrow, and the ACLU itself, totally disappear from Inherit the Wind, both the movie and the play. The omission simplifies the scripts, of course. You have less characters to worry about. But it also serves another purpose, and this is important. As they later explained, Jerry Lawrence and Bob Lee, who wrote the play, they wrote it during the mid-1950s, not to celebrate a 30-year-old trial in Dayton, Tennessee, but rather as a means, as a vehicle, to awaken public concerns about the innocent victims of mass hysteria, then feeding the then ongoing McCarthy-era assaults on the alleged communist and leftist. The trial, the Scopes trial, was simply a stand-in because they couldn't attack McCarthy's hearings directly. It was a stand for that, for McCarthy hearings, much like the trial in Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible. Exact same purpose. They were clear about that. It wasn't about Dayton. They were trying to focus attention. They were using it as a straw man, sort of, as a vehicle, as a theatrical vehicle. And it became the longest-running play in Broadway history. It's very popular. Now, because the ACLU remained a much maligned target of those assaults by McCarthy, identifying its role in the Scopes trial would make it harder to portray Scopes as an innocent victim. Thus, the ACLU disappeared from the legend of its own most famous trial. Well, the prospects of these renowned orators, the two of the most popular speakers in America, public speakers in America, in Bryan and Darrow, actually litigating the profound issues of science versus religion and academic freedom versus public control over public education, turned the trial into a media sensation then and the stuff of legend thereafter. News of the trial dominated the headlines during the weeks leading up to it and pushed throughout the country, from California to New York to Florida, pushed nearly everything else off American front pages throughout the entire 8-day trial. Over 200 reporters. They took over almost the entire courtroom. These are all reporters packed into the Dayton courtroom. For 200 reporters covered the story in Dayton, including some of the country's best correspondents representing many of the major newspapers and magazines. They came from as far away as Europe. Thousands of miles of telegraph wires were hung to transmit every word spoken in the court out over the telegraph wires, like they used to do baseball games back then. And pioneering live radio broadcasts carried the oratory to the listening public. It was America's first broadcast trial. Newsreel cameras, which you can see in the corner in the background there in this picture, newsreel cameras recorded the entire encounter. It was filmed, and that film was flown out every day to major northern cities to project in movie halls so people could watch the trial for themselves down at the movie hall. They created the first landing strip in Dayton. They flattened a cornfield. I think it was a cornfield. It was some sort of field, and so the planes could land to carry the film out every day. The media billed it as the trial of the century before it even began. And it lived up to the billing. By its end, Dayton civic leaders could only marvel at the success of their little publicity stunt and dream of ways to capitalize on their town's new notoriety. This was Southern small-town boosterism at its stereotypical roaring 20s best. The stage directions, if you read it, the stage directions for Inherit the Wind, this is what they say. They stress that, quote, the town is always visible looming there, and watch it, the town is always hovering behind everything that's happening. But at the trial, it was the media that was most visible, looming everywhere, because most of the townspeople rented out their houses to the visiting newsmen and left town. They weren't even there. The courtroom arguments and speeches by both sides addressed the nation rather than the jurors, who missed most of the oratory anyway because it had so little to do with the technical facts of the case that they were excused for all but 2 hours of the whole trial. The defense divided its arguments among the three principal attorneys. Hayes, shown here, focused on the standard ACLU arguments that Tennessee's anti-evolution statute violated the individual rights of teachers. Malone, a modernist Catholic, mostly argued that the scientific theory of evolution did not conflict with an open-minded reading of Genesis, certainly not the Catholic reading he maintained. Darrow, for his part, concentrated on debunking fundamentalist reliance on revealed scripture as a source for knowledge about nature suitable for setting educational standards. Their common goal, as Hayes stated at the time, it was quoted in the newspapers, was, quote, to make it possible that laws of this kind will hereinafter meet the opposition of aroused public opinion. It was a show trial on both sides and by the town. The prosecution countered with a half dozen local attorneys, a lot of them are shown here, hovering around the microphone, of course. That's Stewart and the Hicks brothers. Tom Stewart, some of you may remember, were in a building dedicated to one of the greatest senators, in my opinion, of all time. Well, Tom Stewart wasn't quite that, but he held the seat before Baker. He, based on this trial, he was elected to the U.S. Senate and served 2 terms in the U.S. Senate. And Bryan was there, of course, and Bryan's son, Billy. In court, the defense focused on proving that Scopes broke the law, which wasn't hard to do since the defense didn't disagree with that, and objected to any attempt to litigate the merits of the statute. Now, Inherit the Wind, if you read it, and when you see it, gives due billing to Tom Stewart under the pseudonym Tom Davenport, but the other local prosecutors and the younger Bryan disappear from the account altogether. The elder Bryan, who had not practiced law for over 3 decades, stayed uncharacteristically quiet in court. There's a show standing there, quietly in court, and saved his oratory for lecturing the assembled press and the public outside the courtroom about the vices of teaching that man evolved from monkeys and the virtues of majority rule. He also prepared a thunderous 3-hour-long address on these points that he planned to give as the prosecution's closing argument. Unfortunately for Bryan, heartbreaking for him actually, as the trial played out, Darrow managed to frustrate Bryan's plan by waiving his own closing arguments. And under Tennessee jurisprudence, if the defense waives its closing arguments, the prosecution can't give its. Darrow loved to do things like that. In this and other major scenes of the trial, events unfolded roughly in the order presented in Inherit the Wind. Like any criminal trial, the court, or whether in court or in a play, first comes jury selection. There is the jury being sworn in. Darrow typically stressed this part of the trial as critical for the defense and often spent weeks going through hundreds of endearment before settling on 12 jurors who just might be willing to spare his typically notorious defendant. Darrow had a different objective of the Scopes trial, though, however. He wanted to convict the statute rather than acquit the defendant. And only judges could overturn a statute. Jurors simply applied the law to the facts of the case. Darrow could have won an acquittal by arguing that Scopes, who, remember, was not even a biology teacher, had never actually violated the statute. But that would have left it intact. Instead, the defense sought either to have the trial judge strike the statute, which was all but beyond the role of a trial judge in Tennessee jurisprudence back then, as a matter left to the state Supreme Court, or have Scopes convicted and appeal to a higher court, which would then review the statute. Rather than spend weeks seeking jurors open to acquitting Scopes despite the law, Darrow quickly accepted the simplest of endearment. Their presence on the jury, the defense reasoned, and I've read all their inner thinking on this, their arguments and their notes. Their presence of especially simple-minded jurors would dramatize to the watching nation the spectacle of non-experts sitting in judgment of a scientific theory, which constituted their key objection to the anti-evolution statute. This strategy hit pay dirt when one of the Vendeermen turned out to be illiterate. His exchange with Darrow became the subject of countless news stories and needed little exaggeration in Inherit the Wind. Using that Inherit the Wind version, it goes, and it's almost identical to the actual script. Darrow asked this juror, after other questions, "Have you ever read anything in a book about evolution?" "Nope," the typical reply at trial. Darrow then follows up, as planned. "Well, I bet you read your Bible." Again, the word nope. When a puzzled Darrow, and you know, Spencer Tracy could really look puzzled when he wanted to. When a puzzled Darrow asks why, the Vendeerman simply replies, "Can't read?" To ensure that viewers get the point, the stage directions add, "There are a few titters throughout the courtroom before Darrow declares, he'll do just fine." No sooner was the jury selected than it was excused from the courtroom for days as the parties wrangled over defense motions to strike the statute as unconstitutional. Although these arguments occasionally soared into dramatic pleas for either individual freedom or majority rule, their technical nature makes them difficult for non-lawyers to follow. The trial judge denied them anyway. Everybody knew he would. Inherit the Wind skips over those and goes ahead to the prosecution's case, which actually was even simpler than you'll see when you go to Inherit the Wind. The scene begins with a schoolboy named Howard Morgan in the actual trial, testifying that Scopes taught his class about evolution. On cross-examination, Darrow asked Howard the famous question, you'll hear it, "Did it harm you any?" And coaches out of denial. Morgan remains a gee-whiz, baseball-loving, all-American boy, untainted by his exposure to Darwinism. You'll see it. Then the play concocts testimony from Scopes' fictional fiancée, who Bryan mercilessly grills about Scopes' agnosticism. This, the writers later explained, was inserted to discredit McCarthy-era inquisitions of family and friends of alleged communists. It gives a dark taint to the trial, wholly missing from the actual event. There was nothing like it. Scopes didn't have a girlfriend, and she certainly wouldn't have been called to the stand by Williams Jennings Bryan. In fact, at the actual trial, Scopes had to actually instruct his own students how to testify that he had violated the law, and Bryan offers to pay Scopes' fine. Well, following the prosecution's brief presentation, the defense offers the testimony of 15 expert witnesses. There they are, all sitting there, in science and religion from America's top universities, from Vanderbilt, the state geologist of Tennessee, from Harvard, from Princeton, from Chicago, from Hopkins, all prepared to testify against the statute, all devout Christians, all active in their churches, who said there's no, all Darwin, all evolutionists, all scientists or theologians who say there's no problem between the two. Well, the prosecution immediately objects. The admissibility of such testimony was a key issue at trial. It passes quickly in Inherit the Wind, but consumes days in Dayton. The script captures the heart of the matter, however. Their testimony is basic to the defense of my case, Darrow in Inherit the Wind pleads, for it is my intent to show this court that what John Scopes spoke quietly one spring afternoon in Dayton High School is no crime. It is as incontrovertible as geometry. Bryan formally objects to this testimony as irrelevant to what he views as a narrow question of whether Scopes ever taught evolution. The judge predictably sided with the prosecution. Everybody knew he was going to rule these guys out, not let them speak. This makes Scopes' conviction inevitable. Stage directions for Inherit the Wind instruct Darrow to appear, and I'm quoting here, and I hope the actor follows them, to appear flabbergasted and look around helplessly until there's a glint of an idea in his eye. See how he does on that. Well, nobody can have a glint of an idea in his eye better than Spencer Tracy. But the fact that Darrow would ever look hopeless in a courtroom is fictional. This sets up the most dramatic moment of Inherit the Wind and of the actual trial. They even announce it in the coming attractions as the most dramatic moment. The defense calls William Jennings Bryan to the stand as an expert in religion. It was equally dramatic at the actual event. Although Darrow, it wasn't a surprise. It was a surprise to Bryan, a surprise to the prosecution, a surprise to the judge, but Darrow had been planning it for days, and he'd actually had other people stand in as, in the witness, as, when he was practicing it, as if they were Bryan. It became the most famous scene of American trial court history or courtroom cinema. And it really happened, although not quite as portrayed in Inherit the Wind. Actually, it was Hayes who called Bryan as the defense's final witness, and the volunteer prosecutor proved cooperative. Up to this point, Chief Prosecutor Stewart had masterfully controlled the proceedings, and with the help of a friendly judge, and every lawyer here knows a friendly judge helps, corralled his wily opponents. But Stewart could not control his impulsive co-counsel, especially because the judge seemed eager to hear Bryan defend the faith. The prosecutor objected immediately, and over the course of the proceeding objected to it, said, "You can't do this," over 20 times. But Bryan insisted. They did not come here to try this case, Bryan explained early in his testimony. They have come here to try revealed religion, and I am here to defend it, and they can ask me any question they please. Oh, this was music to Darrow's ears. Thinking the trial all but over, except for the much-awaited closing arguments, the judge had moved the afternoon session outside, onto the courtroom, onto the courthouse lawn. He was up for re-election, and so many people, women couldn't go in the courtroom back then in Ray County. They were not allowed in the courtroom by rule. And it couldn't, with all the reporters, there was no room for most of the townspeople. So he moved it outside onto so that everybody could see the close, because he thought it was going to be the closing arguments. And this is what everyone was waiting for, Bryan and Darrow's closing arguments. The crowd swelled as spread of the encounter between Bryan and Darrow spread. From the 500 persons who had evacuated the courtroom, the number rose to an estimated 3,000 people spread over the lawn, nearly twice the town's normal population. The participants appeared on a crude wooden platform erected for the proceedings, looking much like Punch and Judy puppets, performing at an outdoor festival. You can see the tree in the background. There's Darrow up there. Enterprising youngsters passed through the crowd hawking refreshments. Darrow posed the age-old questions of the village skeptic. Did Jonah live inside the whale for 3 days? How could Joshua lengthen the day by making the sun rather than the earth stand still? And where did Cain, as one of the first only two children of the first human pair, where did he get his wife? In the narrow sense, as Stewart persistently complained, Darrow's questions had nothing to do with the case because they never inquired about human evolution. Didn't, because there's a rule, you probably teach your criminal law student, is in a courtroom, a lawyer never asks a question where the answer can hurt him. And if you set Bryan up to start pontificating on human evolution, you're going to be beat. Bryan's good on that. But what's he going to do with this question? In a broad sense, as Hayes repeatedly countered, these questions, the prosecution objected to them because they had nothing to do with the trial. Hayes reportedly countered that they had everything to do with the trial because they challenged biblical literalism, which stood at the heart of the anti-evolution statute. Best of all, for Darrow, no good answers existed to them. They've been asked for centuries. As Darrow later explained, they compelled Bryan to choose between his crude beliefs and the common intelligence of modern times or to admit ignorance. Now, Bryan tried all three approaches at different times during that afternoon without appreciable success. Darrow questioned Bryan as a hostile witness, peppering him with queries and giving him little chance for explanation. It became like a firing line at times. You claim that everything in the Bible should be literally interpreted. I believe everything in the Bible should be accepted as is given there. Some of the Bible is given illustriously, cuts him off. But when you read that the whale swallowed Jonah, now how do you literally interpret that? I believe in a God who can make a whale and can make a man and can make both of them do what he pleases. See, he's avoiding the answer. But do you believe he made them, that he made such a fish and it was big enough to swallow Jonah? There's a long pause, according to the transcript, and then he says, yes, sir, let me add, one miracle is just as easy to believe as another. Darrow, it is for me just as hard. Bryan, it is hard to believe for you, but easy for me. When you get beyond what man can do, you get within the realm of miracles, it is just as easy to believe the miracle of Jonah as any other miracle in the Bible. Well, such affirmations undercut the appeal of fundamentalism to some. On the stump, Bryan effectively championed the cause of biblical faith by addressing the great questions of life. The special creation of humans in God's image gives purpose to every person, and the bodily resurrection of Christ gives hope to believers for eternal life. But Darrow never inquired about these grand miracles. For many Americans, laudable simple faith becomes laughable crude belief when applied to Jonah's whale, Noah's flood, and Adam's rib. Yet that afternoon, under intense questioning, Bryan reluctantly acknowledged and accepted each of these biblical miracles on faith and publicly professed that all miracles were equally easy to believe. Well, as Darrow pushed his various lines of questioning, Bryan increasingly admitted that he simply didn't know the answers. He had no idea what would happen if the earth had stopped for Jonah or about the antiquity of human civilization. Did you ever discover where Cain got his wife? Darrow asked at one point. No, sir, I leave the agnostics to hunt for her, came the bittersweet reply. Stewart tried to end the 2-hour-long interrogation at least a dozen times, but Bryan refused to stop. I am simply trying to protect the Word of God against the greatest atheist or agnostic in the United States, he shouted, pounding his fist in rays. And here's how he's looking up on the stand. I want the papers to know that I am not afraid to let him get on the stand in front of me and do his worst. And here is Darrow up there. The crowd cheered this outburst and every counter thrust he attempted. Darrow received less applause, but inflicted the most jabs. The only purpose, and now this is from the movie, the only purpose Mr. Darrow has is to slur the Bible, but I will answer his questions. Bryan exclaimed at the end. I object to your statement, Darrow shouted back, both men now standing and shaking their fists at each other. I am examining your fool ideas that no intelligent Christian on earth believes. Well, the judge had finally heard enough. He abruptly ended the court for the day. He never let the interrogation resume the next day, and the jury the case was immediately passed to the jury. And then, at Darrow's request, mind you, the jury is excused for less than 10 minutes and comes back with a guilty verdict. Now, what we've seen is then they show Bryan ranting about not being able to give his closing arguments, and then breaking down and dying in the courtroom. He actually was a week later that he died. As the crowd slips away from him, as he starts babbling on incoherently the names of the books of the Old Testament. In contrast, the trial shows Spencer Tracy, or Paul Mooney on Broadway, carefully ending by balancing the Bible against Darrow's Origin of the Species, putting them together thoughtfully, and walking off to this performance of Leslie Uggams again, who you saw at the beginning, singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Darrow remains a self-proclaimed agnostic, but losing his crusading materialism. At the end, it is Mencken who delivers Darrow's famous slur of Bryan's fool religion, and it is Darrow in the play, you'll hear it, reacts with anger. You smart aleck, you have no more right to spit on his religion than you have a right to spit on my religion or lack of it. Well, the writers have thus reduced Bryan and Darrow to one-dimensional caricatures of themselves and simplified the trial into a three-act mortality play in which secular tolerance happily triumphs over religious bigotry. To ensure viewers appreciate the point, the writers have Scopes ask Darrow after the jury convicts him, and this is him standing for his conviction, did I win or did I lose? Darrow answers, you won. Millions of people will say you won. They'll read in the papers tonight that you smashed a bad law, you made it a joke. Well, it's fine theater, but it hobbles effects to understand the trial's complex historical legacy, where Bryan actually made some very effective points, and Darrow asked the jury to convict his own client. Although partisans on both trials, both sides claimed the advantage at the time, neutral observers, and I read over 100 newspaper editorials on the next day after the verdict, because they all been covering it, not one of these claims the trial was decisive. America's adversarial legal system tends to drive parties apart rather than reconcile them, and that certainly happened in this case. Despite Bryan stumbling on the witness stand, which his supporters readily attributed to his notorious interrogator's wiles, well, who wouldn't look like a fool if being cross-examined by Clarence Darrow? Both sides effectively, I would say both sides, Bryan as well as Darrow, effectively communicated their message from Dayton. Maybe not well enough to win converts, but at least sufficient to energize those already predisposed to their viewpoint. If, as Inherit the Wind declares, millions of people thereafter dismissed anti-evolutionism as a joke, millions more saw it as a cause. And when Bryan died a week later in Dayton, they acquired a martyr to that cause. Huge crowds, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, turned out to watch a special train carry Bryan's bodies to Washington for a state funeral in Arlington National Cemetery, where all of the pallbearers were sitting U.S. senators. Consequently, the pace of anti-evolutionism didn't die down after the Scopes trial. It increased, with more states and more local school districts passing restrictions, but more states voting them down. Of course, the divided and divisive response on issues like this continue to the present, as some school officials impose restrictions on education and others ridicule them. And that becomes the legacy of Scopes. Scopes becomes, with its countless retellings, it becomes part of the fabric of American folklore. It grew to symbolize not simply anti-evolutionism, but secular, conservative, religious motivated interventions in public policies generally. It has been rebooted, Inherit the Wind has been rebooted on Broadway 3 different times. And in the latest one, the review by the New York Times, this was starring Christopher Plummer and Brian Dennehy, the New York Times describes the original confrontation in Dayton as, quote, one of the most colorful and briefly riveting of the trials of the century that seems especially abundant in the sensation-loving 20s. Well, dozens of prosecutions have received the designation of trial of the century over the 20th century, but only the Scopes trial, I maintain, only the Scopes trial fully lived up to that bulling by continuing to echo throughout not only the last century, but into this one, as testified by the response of Tennessee, of University of Tennessee, of the state of Tennessee, and of conferences all across this country that are recognizing the Scopes trial, a little event that happened just down the road 100 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Larson. I know we've bumped up a little bit against our time, but I would like to allow for 2 quick questions, and then he will, of course, be here for other follow-up questions in the front. So, but they do have to be quick, and
I'll be short on the answer.
I'll leave it to you. You can choose wisely then on the.
I was following the advice. I had an hour, and we got started a little late. But I'd love to have the 2 questions if there are 2 questions, and I'll be very brief with my answers. Or if everybody wants to leave, we don't need the 2 questions. I think they voting for dinner. I will be around.
Here we have one.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Is the video of the trial, and can you hear it? Is it audio?
No, they didn't have sound. It was a silent movie. Yes, the video exists. Smithsonian owns a lot of it. Private entities vote. You can Google it now and find parts of it. But yes, it was much of it exists. Unfortunately, you didn't ask this question, but unfortunately, the radio, it was broadcast nationally, but nobody recorded it. That was when you had live broadcasts, and it wasn't taped. So we have plenty of tapes of records of Bryan speaking and Darrow speaking, but not at the trial. And so we don't have the audio port. When it was shown in movie theaters, people would read the script while they were speaking. You know, it was a silent movie. Yes?
Was Clarence Darrow a supporter of Bryan in his presidential campaigns?
He was. He was. They were friends. In fact, in the first presidential campaign, Bryan was nominated for president first in 1896, and Darrow was nominated that year to run for Congress in Chicago that same year by the same party. But Darrow spent so much time campaigning for Bryan that he lost by about 100 votes because he was focusing on helping Bryan try to win. So good question.
All right. So I also want to mention that Professor Larson is going to be at the opening showing of Inherit the Wind tomorrow night.
Yes.
So you can look for him there as well if you have additional questions. But once again, please join me in thanking him for this wonderful lecture on the Stokes trial.
Thank you.